Manaswini Rao was able to log in today, even though it's 6 a.m. Pacific time. So it's bright and early. So she's going to present some of her work with an RCT on dairy cooperatives in India. And so we'll go for about 45 minutes, and then I'll do a short discussion, and then we'll have a longer Q&A after that. Any questions that come up for clarification during the presentation, you can either just jump off mute and ask those directly, or use the chat, and we'll kind of filter that. So go ahead, Manaswini, queue it up and see if you can get your screen on, and take it away from there.
Okay, thank you so much, Kyle. I shared it earlier. Let's see, it comes again now. Oh no, does it screen share? Okay, it does, right?
Yeah,
all right,
that's good.
Okay,
comes perfectly.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much. I'm really excited to present this paper to this audience. It's a joint work with Ashish and I, who's at UC Davis ARE, the Agriculture Resource Economics program. I was a former student at the UC Berkeley Agriculture Resource Economics program. So this paper neatly presents, fits into this audience and where, my background. So the paper is titled "Got Clean Milk: Organizations, Incentives, and Collective Action in Indian Dairy Cooperatives." I don't want to spend too much time motivating, but we all know that small scale production is extremely common throughout the developing world. We hear about small and marginal, like the many millions of small and marginal farmers with less than 1 hectare of land. And even in the non-agriculture sector, we have a really left skew in the distribution of firm size. 90% of the firms hire less than 10 workers. Now, because of the small scale, it is pretty common for production to happen in teams so that they are able to access broader markets, right? So we see this in the examples of cooperative agriculture, whether we think about farmer producer organizations or self-help groups or like consortiums of industries and so on. So an interesting economic features of production in team is that the price signals are applied to the group level product characteristics, right? Whether it's quality or any other characteristics of the product, and the production is not traceable to individual producer. So what it does is that it creates a potential for free riding and collective action failures. However, a production teams are embedded in local communities which have like social structure and social network, which provides local monitoring and enforcement role. Having said that, these structures are not homogeneous or level playing field. They are hierarchical, and there's always, potential for elite capture within these structures. So, there often then is a need for an external or a third party or a central government to come in and like sort of reduce some of this frictions brought in by the imperfectness of social structures. So we study, our research is based in the context of dairy cooperatives in one of the southern states, Karnataka in India. The state has about 2.4 million dairy cooperative members. These are small scale farmers really across 22,000 villages. And the daily throughput is about 2 to 3 million gallons of raw milk per day. And this is not like novel about Karnataka or India particularly. Similar structures exist worldwide throughout the developing world. The local, production, basically the groups of farmers federate together for broader distribution and access to, like, say, urban markets. So the producers are organized into village level cooperatives. These are registered under like Cooperative Society Act. So they are like recognized government entities. And the cooperative members of these dairy farmers, they pool all their milk together for sale to external markets. And payment typically is based on this pooled milk from a particular village, from, like, say, the next level of dairy processing. So what we do in this RCT is we want to, of course, see if we can improve the productivity of the dairy industry or the dairy process in these villages. And because obviously it's really expensive to observe individual level quality, we apply like group level incentives for improving productivity. And by productivity, we mean lowering bacteria content, right? So like one of the frequent problems that we hear about is like how frequently milk spoils. The value added production of dairy industry is really on the lower end, although things are improving much more in the recent decades. And improving this type of productivity, that is lowering bacteria, is a fast moving outcome in the sense that it can be achieved without costly investments by just focusing on sanitation, right? Washing hands, cleaning your cattle, keeping your cow shed clean, and so on. And this enables higher value added processing, right? Like you can think about really making export quality cheese or sweets and chocolates and yogurt and so on. Currently, the system in India, there are no incentives tied for lower bacteria at the level of production. So what we do is we really randomize group level incentives for improving milk dairy productivity through lower bacteria count, and then we further randomize this by providing this information about this incentive structure either privately to just the cooperative management in the village alone, so whom we call the local elites, and I'll show you why these cooperative management is local elite, or we share this widely to a random subsample of the cooperative members as well. And we won't really see. Sure.
Okay, just quick clarifying question on that.
Yeah.
In terms of does there exist a premium, outside of the experiment, a price premium for higher quality?
No, not to the direct, for not at the level of at the production for the producers themselves. So there could be. So what happens is like once all the milk is pooled from many different villages and it goes to a central processor, based on the quality of batches of milk that they get, then they assign the batches of milk to different product categories. So like, okay, if the level of bacteria is high, then they send it for pasteurizing immediately and send it for consumption as milk, that comes into the urban consumer market shelves the next day. And so they have a really short shelf life. Some which kind of pass a higher threshold of microbial load go in for cheese making. I mean, there is a nascent cheese industry in India. People in India are beginning to love cheese. So, some of them do get diverted to that, but that all happens at the processor level, which is a really, really downstream, at the really, really downstream level. So the farmers never get the incentive for, I was very careful in washing hands and cleaning, but I don't receive the payment for it. So that's how things are. Yeah, and the reason behind actually disclosing this information, either just to the cooperative management and sharing it publicly, is to see what happens then. Like, does it ever really affect the bargaining between these cooperative management and the producers, and how does it affect the distribution of surplus, within the cooperative and the farmers? So that's sort of the key piece of the experimental intervention. And just a quick summary of results is overall, we find that even providing small incentives, which is to the extent of 1 to 2.5% increase in the revenue, village cooperative level revenue over a 2-week period where we did the intervention, leads to 81% increase in high quality milk. But high quality milk is like what the USDA would approve for high value added processing. Now, this huge impact is obviously because the baseline levels are so low, and I'll show you as I progress through these slides as to what the baseline level looks like. But an interesting thing that we noted, which was completely unanticipated back then when we did the experiment, but now it all makes sense, having seen a lot more research that kind of find this counterintuitive results, right, is that publicly announcing payments about this payment incentive structure to not just the cooperative members, but also to a bunch of dairy producers, reduces the effectiveness of an incentive. So the treatment effect is half as large as when we just give the information to the cooperative alone. And of course, it's so noisy that you can't even distinguish it from control, like zero basically. And one of the reasons why the treatment effects in public arm, where we provide this information more broadly, is because 1/3 of the cooperative managers decide to completely opt out of this incentive payment structure, but they allow us to kind of continue testing and doing surveys and all that, right? So And an important feature of these managers who opt out, like, I mean, they have lower social status based on their baseline characteristics. So this is even, so we collected a detailed baseline. So the managers who are opting out, like, have lower social standing, wealth, or education levels. So I'll get into like what could be the mechanics, towards the as I progress in the slides. So this paper makes, three key contributions to the literature. I mean, there is a rich literature in, ag and development and decentralization of incentives and corruption and elite capture. But like the key contribution of this paper is, we find that, communities do use informal or non-pecuniary contract enforcement mechanism, which leverages these existing social structure to achieve productivity goals, right? So like, even when we just give information privately just to the cooperative members who are part of the social network of that village, involved in the dairy industry, that's enough to kind of improve the productivity, aggregate productivity of dairy in that particular village. And attempts to improve transparency, for example, could interact with how these enforcement mechanisms are taking place, and it could lead to efficiency loss. And I'll show you like what kind of loss that is and how much money is left on the table. And so this paper shows that, it's actually quite nuanced, right? It's not like very simple that, let's just lay around a transparency initiative and everything would be great. There is a trade-off between how much elite capture to allow and transparency. So, I mean, now I'm going to dive down into the details of the paper, giving you a little bit of context. So the location, as I mentioned, is a southern state of India, Karnataka. We focus on one particular district. We were able to recruit 51 dairy cooperatives. That, I mean, I guess Ricardo had mentioned, like, focus on how difficult things were when we were implementing this RCT. So getting these cooperatives to consent to be part of an experiment, which could be particularly disruptive because we were going many times in a day to do these measurements, collect nil sample, and so on. So, but we were able to get a large majority of the dairy cooperatives in this one particular district. And so this is in southern state of India. Again, like I said, the structures exist everywhere throughout India, at least. So the findings from the study should be relevant anywhere. From these 51 dairy cooperatives, we sampled about 1,000 members, about 20 producer members in each cooperative. And so we have a repeated cross section across the different rounds of survey because the set of farmers who are at the time of survey is contributing to milk are different because they follow the gestation cycle of their cattle, right? So we have a repeated sample of farmers from baseline and end line. So this was a really early morning. So Kyle, like, I'm not really 6 a.m. Is completely okay because we had to be in these villages before 6 a.m. to kind of catch all the farmers, lining up in these collection centers because, of course, milk spoils quickly. So the turnaround time is really quick. They milk the cattle in really early break of dawn, 5:30. And this is like, one of the farmers in our study. You can see he and his wife, I guess, like, whom you can't really see, but there are two smiley faces. They milk the cow in the morning. And then they send their kid or they themselves come to the collection center, which is sort of at the center of the village with their produce of the day. And then the staff in the collection center does a very quick specific gravity check to make sure that milk is not adulterated with water and so on. And it passes a minimum specific gravity threshold. And then once that passes, they just collect the milk and pour it into one of these common collection cans, as you see there, right? And so these cans, and they're sealed and put in these transport vehicles and sent off to the nearest processing station.
So right? I have a quick question on that, Manaswini. And I'm not sure I can see the chat. So if people are putting in their,
me neither.
It says it's muted for me, but Ricardo, maybe you can see if that is active. So, but anyway, my question is, like, how observable are quality improving actions that are taken by the farmer? If we're thinking about sort of the village as a network enforcing collective action, then you'd think that, people would kind of know who is, or be able to see who is at least, who is doing low quality things and who is not. Is it the case that they milk the cow in open air and everybody knows who is being careful and who is not, or is it easier to hide those actions?
So basically, it's easier within the social network to observe each other's practices, but it's difficult for the econometrician to observe any of that, because then we would have to go like door to door or so on. So the way usually people keep the cattle outside their houses, they have their cow shed. And it's quite, when you walk around the village, you really see cows walking around the streets of villages, right? So the neighbors are, able to say like, oh, their cattle is sick, for example, or they really treat their cattle badly, or they don't provide them good feed and so on. And also the dairy cooperative center, right? They're also like sort of the management of these cooperative are also from the village. And just to kind of give you a quick overview, is like they also kind of can control like, okay, who is doing a good job, and they can actually turn away people who they think have adulterated their milk, for example, or like, hey, they poured water. Like that's why they do the specific density check. And, they would have observed if there was something messy going on. So they do turn away people when they come to the production center, to the collection center to pour. So there is these local mechanisms which the econometrician can only observe if they were like kind of, in the field and like chasing people around. But like I say, price signals, like can't do that, because like a processing center just pays based on these cans that are delivered at the center. They really have no no understanding of like how many individuals have poured into one particular can, or like how varying the quality is and so on. And so we hope that these local social networks kind of put those contract enforcement mechanism in place because of repeated interaction. So that's the goal of why we're incentivizing at the cooperative level. So yeah, so as I mentioned, so the structure is basically, there are about 50 to 100 producers per village. The median producer has about one cow. That's in the active for milking. The cooperative has an elected president and secretary. Now, these look very different from the elected president of the local government institutions called the panchayats. These presidents and secretaries are elected for 10-year term, like a longer term. The secretary is basically a younger person, more educated, who oversees the milk collection process. Like that has to do a lot of like running around. He or she, they manage their financial accounts jointly with the president. They both need to sign a check, for example, and they control these incentive payments. The secretary in our experiment. And additionally, to oversee these president and secretaries functioning, there is a board of governors nominated among these dairy producers within these villages, who represent various communities in the village. But in practice, they have very little power in really disciplining the president or secretary in any way. So here is like sort of characteristics, demographics of these. The dairy, the cooperative, the producers are, typical farmer who have 4.5 years of education. A third of them are from the from the scheduled caste and tribe categories, who are among the most disadvantaged communities in India. The land owning is also on the smaller side. They own about 6 acres on average. This is larger than the small and medium farmer, but these are also guys that these are also farmers that have assets like cattle, right? So they're slightly better off than like an average small farmer, and they have a monthly income of 12,000. Now, when we just compare these producers with the cooperative governance, the cooperative management characters, like, or agents, right? Secretary, for example, as I mentioned, has the highest education, followed by the president, and the directors look very, very similar to producers. Like I said, the directors are basically nominated among the producers, who kind of look exactly like them, who are there to kind of keep a check on the president and secretary. On the other hand, the secretary is responsible for like sort of keeping the day-to-day operations of the cooperative going. and they need to have at least what is called the secondary school passing exam certification. So a lot of them, like average years of education is almost 11 years. So they will have some high school education. They know some English. Like at least when we were there, they were able to communicate with us, and of course they have financial knowledge. They are also, like, there is a good fair representation from the SC/ST communities, but not as much as producers or directors. And since the focus of secretary is mainly like younger, like more educated, they're not much into agriculture profession unless they have their parent or somebody owning some land. They make more salary because they're salaried individuals. They make more monthly income than these others. On the other hand, the president is the super elite. I mean, not from the point of education, but they most of them come from non-SC/ST communities. They're mostly from the dominant castes of the village. They own large tracts of land, and they have a much higher monthly income. And they've also been, like, at least a fifth of them have been part of the local panchayat in the past. So you see the structure now, right? So all this cooperative is basically a consortium of producers in the village, but there is this kind of hierarchy. There's a differential between the ones who are running the cooperative in the management and those who are just coming and contributing milk for sale. And even when we at baseline, we collected, rankings about the, cooperative members, like, what do you, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much power do they wield, and so on, what kind of social status do they have in the village, and so on, and what is the management quality. Routinely, both producers and directors themselves, like, rank the secretary and president way higher than the directors, right? So basically, you see that the governance structure is kind of skewed towards really strong secretary and president. You do have, like, some nominal oversight, but it's not in practice strong at all. So in our intervention, like I said, we provide group level incentives for quality of milk, right? And so that involves some amount of testing, and this was one of the biggest challenges, right? So we did 4 rounds of testing in total, like 2 at baseline to kind of like figure out like the testing tools and making sure that this was accurate and so on. I mean, that was a lot of the pilots. I mean, we did multiple rounds of testing to kind of arrive at the fact that, okay, we're going to use MBRT, and so the 2 methods of measuring by microbial load, right? One is a simple chemical test. It's called a methylene blue reduction test. It's basically putting a reagent in the milk sample and just it's a blue colored solution, and then waiting for it to completely decolorize. And the time from the time of putting this reagent in the sample to it completely decolorizes is basically the result for this MBRT test. So it ranges from 0, like immediately can decolorize if there's too much microbial load, or it can take like 6+ hours, in which you can say that, the colonies are slowly building, but like in the beginning, there weren't that many colonies to kind of immediately decolorize. The second method is like more scientific, or what the USDA uses for setting these standards is the standard plate count. So where they take a drop from a sample and put it on under the microscope to kind of like count the bacteria colony or like microbial colonies. And so, of course, to kind of figure out like who could do this in this district, it took a while to kind of get to that, and it ultimately worked out. We found a local engineering college which had these labs, in the biotech department, and so they were very excited to kind of like partner with, universities, U.S. universities. Where sort of they can also kind of put in some of their students in this testing process. Helps them from sort of connecting to real world application. And so that really worked well. But the challenge was, this local engineering college was at the district headquarters, which was a couple of hours away from where these villages are located. So we announced, we gave 2-week window to each of the dairy cooperative societies that, hey, in the next 2 weeks, we may come to collect some of the sample from at the time of milking. So we'll come show up at 6 a.m. when you open up for milk collection. But we can't tell you beforehand like which day we will come, but we just give them a window in which we randomly arrive at the time of collection, and then we take a sample from each of the cans that were like sealed before sending off for processing. And yeah, we have to immediately chill it, because obviously we don't want our sampling and transportation process to kind of add to the bacteria growth. And so like, yeah, we had to chill it in an ice box and send it to the lab. And then once we get the lab results, which is typically in 2 days, at least for the MBRT is much quicker, we come within 2 days to deliver the payment.
Just a quick question to clarify on that. When they came to collect the samples, did they collect any data at that time as well? Observations on, what the cooperative place looked like, whether they had, clean bottles, sort of, actual data on that?
No. So I think, so we did two. So I'll walk you through the timeline of our experiment. We did like 2 rounds of surveys, but that was sort of detached from this testing, like the collection. So when they came, so we have some anecdotal evidence from our enumerators as to what was going on at the collection centers, but like it had to happen quick, and in multiple different cooperatives had to go, because the timing was really like they had to show up at 6 a.m. So we couldn't do much given our budget to kind of also collect data on what was going on at the cooperatives. But we did like a baseline and an end line surveys immediately before and after this testing process. So that kind of hope to give some idea on what's going on here.
And you had to do about 4 of those a day, I guess.
Sorry?
Or so. 4 of those, 4 villages per day.
Something like that. Exactly. Okay. Exactly. So yeah, it was, and we had to like plan these collection routes and like, how quickly can we get to the lab and so on. So it was pretty challenging to kind of get the staff to do anything else. So we probably had 1 or 2 staff going to these village, on a bike, and like, one would be riding it and the other would be collecting and putting in the ice box and so on. Yeah, and of course the enumerators, if we added any more tasks, they were like, no, we can't do this, is already a complicated project, we can't do any more than this. But yeah, we have some, we definitely have some pictures and anecdotal evidence as to what's going on. I mean, just like honestly, like compared to like say the dairy processing here in the US, Kyle, like these are really tiny village cooperative centers. They're not super hygienic or clean. You can see a lot of flies. When you look at these collection equipment also, you'll be suspect like, oh my God, like even if you, I mean, obviously we were offered tea and milk as a norm is, and we don't want to upset them, and I would drink it there on site. But you would, when you look at the way milk is collected and so on, you would want that, oh my God, I want this to go to like high pasteurization or processing before I could drink it. But that's how things are, like they're not hyper sanitary. And we hope that our incentives like helped move the distribution somewhat better, and I'll show you that in a second. So at baseline, I mean, here I'm showing you what the group level or the collective quality is at baseline using the USDA processing requirement. So we also did the standard plate count, which is really, really expensive. And it was hard to do because, you had this lab technician, like, do the actual colony counts under the microscope. And it took a couple of days actually to kind of get the results back. But still, we do have a baseline of, how did this look like? And only 16% of the cooperatives or the cans, right, the can level samples met the USDA processing requirement, right? So that means a ton of these like had really high loads of colony forming units. And then to kind of see that there is some extent of free riding happening, whether between individual producers or between individuals and the cooperatives, like who is slacking off, there's somebody slacking off, right? So here we plot the distribution of the MBRT, because MBRT is much more scalable and cheaper method of measuring, the bacteria, the microbial load. Sorry, I keep saying bacteria, but what we can measure is basically microbial load. Like you can't distinguish between different strains of bacteria. So you do see when we compare at baseline, when we had a lot of leftover money in the budget, right? We had not yet started eating into it. So we're like, great, let's measure individual quality as well. And then, we started, like at that time, for people who were lining up in the collection center, we also took samples from a random subsample of people who were lining up in the collection centers directly from their vessel, or where their vessel that they brought from home to kind of deliver the milk. And then we also took samples from the can. And we overlaid these graphs, and you can see that the pooled milk is significantly worse than the individual quality, right? So there are some individuals who are, using very sanitary practices, but of course they're a really, really small number. Majority is, have really average quality. But when we take the sample from the cans themselves, they're about a 0.5 standard deviation. This is like a large effect size from a treatment perspective, worse than the individual milk, right? So there is some extent of free riding going on, right? Like some guys are doing really well, but they're not getting compensated for it. And a lot of these guys who are doing worse are like hiding among the people who are doing really well. And these guys are not getting punished either. And of course, the management is also not getting punishment. The management is also not getting punished because, nobody can separate out like management's effort from the producer effort. So this is the incentive structure that we paid for treated cooperative societies. Gave a participation fee because of a disruption and coming and testing. So we gave everyone like a 500. We said that, okay, look, we'll give you a base of 500 rupees. And this was back in 2014. So, it was quite a bit, right? Like, I mean, of course, if you think in today's terms, like you're like, this is a really small amount, but back like this was already 7 years ago, that was not a trivial amount back then. And we said, okay, on top of this 500, we will put a penalty or a bonus depending on how you do in the quality measure, right? So if you MBRT, now so most of the farmers and the cooperative management knew what an MBRT was, but it was hard for them to understand what standard plate count is, right? So sure, I mean, and it's also harder and more expensive to do standard plate count at the level of each cooperative over and over again. So we just did like MBRT, and we said, look, your incentives are going to be tied to the MBRT results on the day we show up randomly. So, we're not giving them time to kind of like arrange the good guys to kind of come up and deliver milk. We just give them like a 2-week window, and then we show up unannounced. And so we construct like a really convex incentive structure, where for those whose average quality is really high, they can earn up to like 2,000 rupees in total from the intervention in one round. And we did 2 rounds of intervention. On the other hand, those whose quality is really bad, like they get 0 net incentive, but we obviously don't apply any penalty in which they need to compensate us. So the incentive structure is such that either there is status quo, like they don't get anything, or they get some positive even at really, really low levels of the microbial load. So they'll get some cash, right? So the timeline of the experiment is, we did this experiment. Yeah.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question? Like, this is Guanghong from Yuri. So can I ask, like, how this incentive level has been determined? Like, how this numbers has been determined?
Yeah, so we were like we want to keep it convex, because the effort cost from going to improve everybody's quality in the cooperative is going to be much harder, and so we wanted to compensate that. So as you know, like, I mean, we don't want to keep the incentive structure linear, right? So we're like, okay, it may be easier to go from 3 to 4 hours to 4 to 5 hours, and therefore the jump in the bonus is only 300 rupees. But then for every next level of improvement, we just kept doubling it. Almost.
Got it. So given that this will be a convex incentive mechanism, then for the level, we basically take a look at the percentage of their total sales in a particular day, or how do we determine the?
We don't take sales. We just look at the microbial load in the sample that we take. So basically, this is about the microbial contamination and not really quantity of production. So we want to make sure the quality of the milk is good. So from the sample that we take, we make sure that we take a homogeneous sample. Like, it's not, we make sure that if they have 5 cans, we take samples from all the 5 cans, a little, obviously, maybe 30 ml each. and yeah, and so and we pay based on that day's quality of milk from the sample. So yeah, if it is like 4.5 hours, for example, that's how long the MBRT, like the reduction time, takes place, then they get 1,000 rupees, which we come back 2 days later and give it to the secretary.
Got it. Thank you. That's helpful.
It might, Manaswini, it might help here to like tie this to the effort that would be required to get like an MBRT of 5 to 6 hours to get a sense for like how the effort level looks. Like, is it really hard to get an MBRT of 5 to 6 hours, or is it just a few simple things that you can do in order to get to that higher incentive, to try and sort of help us understand, you know, whether that is even achievable, or it requires really costly effort?
Exactly. And that's actually an open question. Like, I mean, we do kind of say, I mean, we don't know the effort cost. You know, we can't measure the effort cost, but generally, so because these incentives are applied at the group level, so the effort costs are multiple at multiple levels. So one is the effort cost by the cooperative management itself to keep the premises clean, or to kind of like disseminate this information about clean milking practices to the producers. So there is that coordination cost that the management has to incur, right? And I don't know how costly that, like, it could be that like they send out their staff door to door, sort of giving the producers information about clean milking practices. But in theory, it's just like keeping, you know, standard sanitation, wash your hands, right? So if we think that washing hands is not a super costly exercise in terms of the rational agent model, but it could have huge behavioral costs, right? Like, because, you know, they're not used to washing their hands. So like, we can't really assign a particular cost to such kind of, habit, for example. But there are costs are twofold. One is like to ensure that like the producers are cleaning milk. We have some surveys evidence to show that like there is some effort being put at the producer level also. And the effort from the cooperative level is basically coordination and keeping the premises clean. So I mean so just to give a context, the monthly salary of the the cooperative secretary at that time was about 3,000 rupees. So these incentives are really comparable. They're like substantial fraction of the monthly salary of the secretary. So these are not trivial incentives, and therefore like any effort cost is well compensated, provided that we are comparing it to their reported salaries and not some hidden surplus that they were getting earlier. So these nuances I'm going to come to later when we look at the results of what's going on in the public treated arm, and that kind of shows that, you know, so these things need to be taken into account. So I can come to that. I can come back to answering this question at that point again. So thank you for that.
Okay, about 11 minutes. Is that
okay? Yeah. All right. So let me quickly go through so the timeline. We did a baseline survey immediately followed by 2 rounds of testing. Then we had to pause for a bit because there was a calving season. Then we resumed our intervention process, after 6 months, and then we did the end line. So we had 51 dairy cooperatives. And because we did 2 rounds of intervention to get additional power, we initially randomly assigned more cooperatives to the control and the private payment compared to the public, and then redid a random reassignment in round 2 to kind of increase the number of dairy cooperatives at the public arm. So in total, they're balanced when we kind of pool it across the 2 rounds between these 3 groups that we have. And so because we have these multiple rounds of testing, at least 4, our empirical specification that we use is a difference in difference, where we sort of account for the fixed effects of the dairy cooperative society. So any kind of unobserved time invariant structure of the cooperative and so on is absorbed in the fixed effect for the dairy cooperative. We include the fixed effect for each of the round of testing. And these are the dummies for private, those dairy cooperative societies that were assigned to private, and those that were assigned to public. And because we set up in a difference in difference setup, these dummies like switch on to 1 at the time of intervention and there's 0 during baseline. So everyone, so all the dummies are 0 for baseline rounds, and then they switch on at the time of intervention based on which villages are assigned to private versus public in round 1, and then there is a re-switching in round 2. So the baselines and the endline surveys at the individual level, and we have repeated cross sections. So we still do difference in difference, but we do we have a repeated cross section. So we still use the DCS fixed effects, and then there are some outcomes where we are only measuring at the end line, in which case we just do simple difference in means. Okay, so the main headline result is that, so using both the standard plate count and MBRT, we create an index of cleanliness. And we see that the private incentive, like where we provide the information about the incentive structure only to the cooperative, increases the productivity by 0.6 standard deviation. So the idea behind constructing an index is also that it standardizes, and then you get the effect size in terms of standard deviation. On the other hand, the improvement in the public incentive arm is half as much. I mean, it is large, right? I mean, 0.3 standard deviation or 0.4. 0.3 to 0.4 is pretty large, but then of course it's very, very noisy, and we can't rule out that it's no different from the control. So what this means is that there's an 81% increase in milk suitable for processing as per USDA. Now, over time, what does this look like? I mean, this is just demeaned quality index over time. You see the private really taking off, where only the management know how things are going. The public also does well, but there are some transparency cost, quote unquote, right? And so there is a gap between how well the public does versus private. And the the effects that we observe is across the distribution. So the average effects are not driven by 1 or 2 dairy cooperatives that do really well. So the solid line is control, and you see the private arm is to the completely to the right of the control arm. The public is super noisy, right? So you can see it going all across. And so we do see an improvement overall in the distribution as well. At the mean. And so what's happening? What are the margins of adjustment? So there is so the first stage is fine, like the public incentive arm, like people know, like more farmers are aware about these incentive structure. There's no leakage of that information in private, right? The management is not going out and giving this information to the producers that, hey, these bunch of external actors have come and incentivizing us to produce better, so please improve your practices. So nobody knows. But when we ask them, like, how clean, do you think each other's practices are compared to control, all the producers think that the other producers have really improved in the production practices because they observe each other, and then they see, there's some kind of messaging that's gone from the management, which doesn't talk about the money that they're getting, but they're saying that, hey, you all need to improve your practices. And so what we do is, of course, our enumerators found that, look, they saw secretaries washing their collection equipment cans, and then, the producers themselves have increased beliefs about each other's cleanliness processes. And this is even true, in the private treatment arm where people don't know that the payments are being made. So there's some, there is an action being taken to kind of improve productivity. And one of the reasons why we see the attenuation of treatment effects in public incentives is the fact that 30% of those assigned to public opted out of the incentive structures. They said, okay, we are not, so we did one round of intervention. When we went to payment, to making the payment, they were like, oh no, you're informing people as well. We don't want that. This is going to lead to problems. Can you just stop the study? We were like, no, we can't. I mean, you consented and so on. Then they were like, okay, so can we just do this privately? Can you just give us the money and don't tell anyone? They were like, no, we can't do that. And the only thing, I mean, then they were like, no, I don't know what, then just don't give us the money at all, just come do your thing, and that's it. So this was also a challenge for us. Like, we had to navigate this issue without sort of affecting the research design, because we couldn't like allow them to endogenously choose a private incentive. So we were like, okay, fine, we were coming and doing the measurements, but yeah, they said that they don't want to get paid. So we're like, fine, we won't pay you. And so about a 30%, like 1/3 of the cooperatives, 7 basically of 20 that were assigned to public, they opted out. And so that's something we see. Yeah.
A quick question, like for the column 1 and 2, the payment are bonus payments given by the researchers, right?
Yes, these are exactly. So basically
how should we interpret the control means, like 700 rupees here?
Yes, yeah. So the control mean is, I mean, the control group didn't get any payment, but we did measurement, right? So this is the amount that the control group would have received if they had got the payment. So we have the MBRT at the control group. So the mean MBRT result in the control group is about 3.44. Even though they didn't receive the money, like the incentives, like we wanted to see how much differential incentives that the public and the private treatment arms received if the control had received the money equivalent, to kind of get the true counterfactual.
I see. So these are payments they will get in theory, not the actual payment.
Exactly. So the actual payment that they got would be like much higher and would be statistically significant and on that, but like then that's wrong, right? Because the control would have also, I mean, they had some baseline quality, right? So they were not really at 0 MBRT. So yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. So yeah, just to kind of go back to the quality over time graph. So now when we kind of account for this opting out behavior, you see the public group line up, right, post intervention with the private. There's no difference among the compliers in the public, but the ones who are opting out looked very different at baseline from those guys who continued, right? And of course, there was no change in their quality after the intervention. So these guys that were opting out on the margins were the ones that looked very different. And for this group of this type of cooperatives, like a public style intervention is not going to work. So who are these guys, right, who are dropping out? So one of the things that we found, that those guys who were dropping out, the directors, the group of directors were really, really weak, right? So they were less likely to attend meetings. They were less powerful as per the producers, the members themselves. Their management quality, like, how well do they know to kind of like go and oversee the financial records and so on, were also weak. And so on, right? So you see that the oversight committee is definitely weak in those groups that were opting out, and it's like there's statistically significant, right? Like if you look at a joint difference. And so what we find is that these cooperatives can internally solve this collective action problem or the free riding, where providing just small incentives, from the point of view of the revenue of the cooperative, lead to the substantial gain. So there means that there is some kind of local social structure and informal enforcement mechanisms that improves the aggregate productivity. And this requires some kind of buy-in from these elites, right, who have control over the financial information. And when they can't control this information, such managers opt out. And so if we kind of consider, I mean, I don't go into detail of a model that we put together, but if you just think of production team model with a manager and a worker, where some of the worker effort is contractible, like workers work together to produce like a public good that the management also benefits from, but the management can hide a portion of the aggregate revenue. And in addition, once they declare the revenue, there is bargaining over the surplus allocation, like how much should the management keep for their own benefit and for quote unquote benefit of the cooperative society, or how much should be kind of shared back to the producers as dividends for their shares, right? And so what we find from this this framework is that some work, of course, must be contractable, like workers need to be compensated for increased effort in one way or the other. It could be pecuniary or non-pecuniary ways. And then weaker management have more to gain from hiding information before they declare versus ex post bargaining, right? So there's some, correlation that we find from this model. We find a correlation that the quality of the management or the strength of the management really kind of then informs whether they're going to more likely to hide the income source, or they're more likely to share it and then bargain over surplus. So given this, it's really puzzling that 30% of the public villages or cooperatives opted out because some amount of cleaning, I mean, even if you just clean your hands or like clean the cooperative collection equipment, is profitable, right? Like there would be some positive payment at baseline. You saw like control group itself was 3.4 and they would have received 700 rupees, but they didn't get that. And so they cannot receive negative payment. So why did they choose to opt out? And Kyle, as you said, there could be a cost story behind it. We don't know. Of course, we one thing we observe is, we observe that there is lower aggregate surplus, right? So the aggregate productivity is lower in public. And it must be that these managers bear some cost, whether it is an effort cost in cleaning the utensils at the collection centers, or it's the coordination cost of making sure that like producers are doing their job. And it's not a simple story where, the farmers or producers come to the secretary and say, hey, you increase your, effort without any compensation, because these managers are powerful and they have formal and informal authority. And there's no evidence of money that the producers themselves receive, right? So they receive like no transfers. So basically they receive nothing in either private or public. So the producers didn't get any money. And so it's not the story that the producers expected the management to put this cost, put an effort cost without compensation. But the producers were putting cost, right? Because we saw the producers' belief that each other were cleaning more. And so we heard these statements from these managers that, opted out. They said that, hey, now farmers are going to regularly start expecting payments, for all kinds of activities that we do. They'll be angry that this incentive that we are paying as external agents are going to the cooperative, and they are the ones that are producing milk, and rightly so. And so there are two plausible explanations, right? So, I mean, unfortunately, like we don't have enough data to kind of like rule out one versus the other. It must be that there is some coordination cost, and the payment that we're making from this incentive structure, net of these costs, is not adequate. Like of course, in the public, there is no way of information hiding, right? So like the information is out in public. And so the aggregate payout from the level of productivity that they can induce is not sufficient for the cost of coordination and cleaning. And given the fact that these management that opt out are low on their quality and bargaining power, right? And so we can't distinguish whether it is the surplus allocation between the producers and the management does that bargaining break down, or is the aggregate itself quality, the incentives that we paid in the incentive schedule not steep enough to kind of compensate them. So yeah, unfortunately, we had to stick with a particular payment schedule ex ante without knowing what's going to happen in the future. And so we have the structure, the function, what we have. And it looks like there are these differential costs based on the quality of management. And it could also be that our experiment has a spillover effect on regular functioning of these cooperatives, right? So like our disclosure could threaten other kinds of information rent. So because these management control overall cooperative financial records, even outside of a experiment. And so they could worry that the farmers will come and ask them about their entire financial accounts. So yeah, that's to conclude that, incentivizing at the group level, there is an efficiency gain, right? But, elites may block these efficiency gains if, they find that somebody's trying to constrain their power. And so there is this trade-off between achieving policy goals and how do we minimize this elite capture. And it's much more nuanced than just kind of publicly disclosing information. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about like challenges in implementation, but I'll kind of end, the main talk now, and we could just talk about it, how we actually went about implementing as part of the discussion. but I put out like what all our key challenges were in the slide, and happy to talk about. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Cool. Thanks, Manaswini. So what we'll do now is I'll do a very short sort of discussion. I read over the paper and have a few suggestions and thoughts. And then after those reactions, then we'll open it up for a broad Q&A, if that's okay. But that short discussion is going to require me to reveal my team's inability to do anything. And so I'm going to do share content here and share a few quick slides really quick, if that's okay. Gosh. Okay, Mina, we're going to have to go to plan B because of course Teams won't let me share. So can you bring up those slides?
Absolutely.
I always think I fix Teams to allow me to share, but it never does. Doesn't like me. Great. So we can just quickly go through these because I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So if you could go to the next one, Nina. So yeah, this is a really cool paper. This idea of studying the effectiveness of group incentives, I think, in agriculture and studying these groups more generally, I think is important. And for the reason that ag production frequently, I think, is organized into groups. And I think in terms of motivation in the paper, you can probably push this a bit harder. That, there's a lot of examples, dairy cooperatives being just one of them, where decisions in smallholder agriculture are made in groups. So I put, dairy cooperatives here. Joint lending might not be always in the sort of smallholder agriculture space, but in theory it could be. Irrigation management, I know you've got work on irrigation management as well, and there's water users associations that make decisions, collectively often. And so I think there's examples, numerous examples outside of the dairy cooperatives that we can lean on a bit harder to motivate this even more generally. But given these groups, we need to really understand the social dynamics of these organizations to figure out how policies and technologies are going to work. And so the idea that I like here is that these group incentives can improve the quality of the milk. But there might be this trade-off between allowing the cooperative leader to capture some of that or all of that surplus, or being required to distribute it. So Mina, you can go to the next one. So I think my main suggestions, and I'll go through these quickly, is to try and sort of contrast, or I don't want to say push the data too far because you just don't have a lot of data here, but to try and contrast some different interpretations of the results. And I think in reading the paper, the mechanism that I really take away, and I think the one that gets pushed the most in the narrative of the paper, is that these social networks in the villages are strong enough to overcome the free riding and to induce this collective action where everybody improves quality. At the same time, nobody in the private payment arm really knows that these payments are happening. So it seems that like strong norms around collective action in the village would require people knowing that there's some benefit of the action. So I'm not saying that this mechanism is not unlikely, but it just feels less likely given that there's less knowledge of the incentive. So it would have to be the case that there's some other some other reason that people become aware that there's a benefit or there's a need to improve quality, and that happens all of a sudden. Maybe the cooperative leader, makes an announcement that, hey, we need to be careful, knowing that they can capture some of those incentives. And then there is this norm around collective action. But my thought would have been that it was going to come through, people knowing that there's a benefit through higher prices. And so it makes me think that sort of the ability of the network to overcome free riding might not be the exclusive mechanism. And so you might want to sort of suggest or point to that there's other things that might be going on. And the next two slides are a couple of things that I think are potentially relevant. So Mina, you could go to the next. And here's one of them, and then the third one, which I think maybe even is more relevant. But the second is that local cooperative managers, these are powerful people. They're sorry, I use the word manager, but what it is. They influence farmers to put more effort into quality production. But they are powerful, and so they can capture the direct benefits from doing this. They can actually capture the incentive. And they don't pass that through to farmers through higher prices, but they pass it through to farmers through other benefits. And I'm kind of thinking a bit about Lorenzo Casaberry and Tristan Reed's work, where the traders are responding to a price subsidy by providing credit to farmers. In this case, if there are other possible margins of adjustment, things like paying the farmers on time, or processing fees, reducing processing fees, or other ways that those benefits could be passed through to farmers, it would be good to, you might not be able to look at it in the data, but it might be worth a mention that some of that might be going on, and it's just hard to observe the different ways that the quality premium could be getting passed through. If you have data on them, all the better, because then you could compare those across the two arms. And so then the third one is where I think the most, if you go to the next slide, Mina, in reading this, and this is why I asked the question about the cooperative managers and what they can really do at the distribution, that point of aggregation, because I'm thinking about like individual level, like group collective action, people enforce a norm around quality, or it's just that the cooperative manager and at the cooperative, they do a better job of cleaning the bottles. They themselves can do things to improve quality. And prior to the intervention, they were not getting compensated for those, and now they are. And so they then take those actions like clean the bottles. They want to keep the surplus from taking those actions, but making those incentives public knowledge, the farmers then can't separate from like, hey, those incentives were paid because at the cooperative they did a better job cleaning the bottles versus at our house we did a better job milking. And so, it could just be not like collective action at the level, the village network, but just the incentives for the cooperative person to actually invest in their own effort. They need to be able to fully capture the returns from those. So I think the ideal here would have been, and probably you had this in mind before you saw how expensive it was to test individual milk, but like to test the quality both at the farmer level and then after it was processed at the cooperative level to see where the improvement was. But that's, obviously that's not a very useful suggestion because, you can't go back and do it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, the graph that I showed, the distribution of the CAN and the individual MBRT, which we did in baseline, we at least had that. And that's when we're like, oh no, we can't now, because we don't have at the end line, we can't sort of really see if it's the cooperative that increased the effort, because, the difference is exactly around the same ballpark as what we find in our effect size. Yeah. If our effect size was really, really large, then we can say that surely it is beyond the effort of the cooperative alone, right? Like suppose, we saw like one standard deviation, then we can show for sure that it should be coming from both margins. But with the current effect size that we have and the fact that at baseline, there was the cooperative pooled milk was much lower than the individual averages. That's then, we're like, okay, but we should probably.
So I think that you might want to just maybe lean less heavily on this collective act, because I can envision a bit of pushback from the reviewers and so on, that what you might just be observing is actions being taken by the cooperative. And even in the paper you mentioned those, not with data, but mention the people observing cleaner bottles and so on. And so if you had that, that's why I asked the question, if you had that data, then including those outcomes, hey, do you see them scrubbing the bottles for both the treatment and control, I think would be great, because then you'd have an outcome that's measuring that, not just kind of substitutes for being able to observe the milk quality both pre and post aggregation at the cooperative. But either way, I think it's definitely worthwhile to just kind of lean less heavily on the collective action and kind of point to some of these other stories that might be going on here. So I'm not going to take much more time because I think I have a couple other slides here, but they're all kind of small points. If you go to the next slide, Mina, just quickly, there's a couple things that are smaller about like the compliance. You mentioned it was re-randomized, but I didn't find that directly in the paper, and so just to avoid the pesky referee not be very loud about that, like, okay, this was re-randomized and it wasn't sort of endogenous. So, but there's other small things, and I don't want to take up more time though, because I want to leave up plenty of time for discussion and other questions. So I'll send you Manaswini these slides, and also whatever scribbles I made when I was going through the paper. But it was definitely fun to read, and I do think that, like, we need to know more about these collectives and these groups to understand how policies like this work, and even how technologies technologies work. So this was cool. So I think Ricardo, let's if we can go ahead and start a Q&A session. I had a hard time figuring out the chat, so I didn't see any activity in the chat. But at this point, let's just open it up for the people to just jump right off mute and ask questions.
Sure.
I can. Oh yeah. Okay. You've already stopped me from sharing. Thank you. You know that I have no idea what I'm doing here with this. So appreciate it. Yeah. So go ahead, Nils. Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks very much. Yeah, it really was a very interesting paper, and we're all eager to know how the dairy industry in India can develop. I have two small questions. Firstly, maybe I didn't pay enough attention, but what actually stimulated to ask this question about the difference between private and public information? Because generally in Indian dairy, as I know, figures are plastered on walls, and you have these fat percentages, and everybody has to know, everybody has to watch milk testing equipment, because transparency is really thought to be the main contributor to the stability of village cooperatives, and the secretaries have to be able to be controlled by everybody. So this idea of being very selective and private is quite amazing. So I was wondering where this came from. And the second question is, again, this thing about the farmer milk and the pooled milk. In theory, there couldn't be any difference because it's the same milk, isn't it? So the only two explanations I would think of is that either the good farmers have much less milk and the bad farmers have a lot of milk, or that at the pooling itself, the collection center equipment is so poor that just by putting it into these large cans, it already deteriorates completely. So I know that the data you have is limited, but I mean, interpreting these different graphs is really tricky if you don't know much. So I'd be a bit careful, because it can go in all different directions.
Yeah.
And it is quite speculative. Thanks very much. It was really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Nils. Should I address?
If there's any response to that, it often takes a bit of time to queue up other questions. So if you wanted to respond to that, then go ahead. I prefer to go one by one rather than collect 5 questions. At least as a speaker, it's always hard for me to collect 5 and figure out, So go ahead and respond to that, and then we'll queue up the next one.
Thank you, Nils. Yeah, I think the question about the comment about CAN and individuals well taken. Yeah, we don't emphasize that much in the paper. I mean, I was just trying to show it as an illustration, and you're right. I mean, a large fact could be that it's driven by the quality of the cans, and that's what we wanted to show, given that on average, like, the contribution, there is some variation, but the median farmer owns 1 cow, and like most of these are like these hybrid variety of cows where indigenous cattle variety are breeded with HF or Jersey. So in terms of but of course, there are very, very few individual farmers at high level. So yeah, there could be like crowding out. But what we also did was like doing the averages at the village level across the individual samples and plotting that against the average of the can level. So yeah, sure. I agree that I agree that there are these nuances that can get hidden, but the idea is to show that there's some thing that happens at the collective where the quality of the collection center itself could be bad. And the second thing is like, why did we think about public? I mean, we were thinking about this classic, dairy industry providing this opportunity to study this free rider problem. So we were like, sorry, the whole idea with public is not just public from the point of view of, keeping the cooperative management under check, like, disclosing information that, that's going only to the management, but also for the producers to know and monitor each other. So we want to make sure that, like, hey, given the fact that you're pooling all your milk and the fact that the incentives don't trace back to the individual farmer, and farmers should also know that, right? And so now we're providing these incentives, and if farmers know that we are providing these incentives more broadly, they also peer monitor. So that was the idea of like sort of bringing this additional peer monitoring angle, which kind of doesn't work that well in our context because it's mostly like top down, right? Like a sort of transparency around the elites that get focused on.
So you were hoping to show the additional positive, the positive effect of peer monitoring, and actually it worked the other way around.
We thought, yes, exactly.
Okay,
we
great.
thought that,
that's fine.
Yeah. We thought it would be better. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Two questions. Guang Hong.
Sorry, it's my turn, or?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I have one thought about, the difference between like individual quality mean and then also the collection center level. Is it because of like, one is the arithmetic mean and another one is like weighted average? So like, it could be like one individual farmers have a large volume, which is dirtier, right? So then this is the one driving the whole result or something like that. Another thing I want to ask is really about like, since, at the slice of implementation challenges, you mentioned about several quality measures. One is adoration, one is bacteria, which is the paper about, and also some other quality measures. So may I ask why we choose this by, bacterial load instead of others? And also, I'm not sure, this is a technical question, like this quality measures are all before pasteurization, right? So
yes,
I'm not sure whether the pasteurization would take care of the bacteria to a large percent, like 90% of the bacteria will be killed by pasteurization. So my question mainly is like, okay, is this quality measure really something we should care about, or we should care about some other like adulterations or antibiotics residues which cannot be taken care of by the pasteurization? Thank you. That's my question.
Good, thanks, Guanggo. So, Kai, should I answer that?
Yeah,
great.
Go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, I agreed about the can versus individual. I'm not going to put too much. I think I can even remove it from my slides. We just kind of try to show it as a motivation. Yeah, a lot of things could be going on, arithmetic versus weighted averages and so on. The second thing about why did we focus on microbial load in raw milk? Because one is, of course, it is from the why do we care? Like that's important because even though there is pasteurization that takes care of some of the microbial load, but at the time in the processing center, they do measure the bacterial load at the raw milk level by each batch, and then they segregate it for different products. So the ultra pasteurization happens for low shelf life milk for consumption versus higher quality raw milk gets sent for cheese and so on. And of course, USDA has this various guideline on raw milk quality characteristics for different products. So in that sense, improving the reducing bacteria or microbial load in raw milk is useful for higher value added processing. Now, the other question that you asked is again, why we didn't focus on adulteration or I guess like the other measures that we were thinking on was fat and SNF, which is the main quality parameters on which the people get paid in India. So there are a couple of things. One is, of course, from the experimental point of view, like we want some measure that is fast moving, right? Like, of course, we have limited resources, and we want to be able to see like will our low level incentives, because as experimenters, most of us were graduate students back then, or not even. I was just starting off. I was in my first year PhD. Like we had limited resources, so we want to make sure that like any of our intervention, which obviously is not going to be like hyper large from a policy perspective, these are like tiny incentives that we're really giving, right? And if these were to happen, create like large effect sizes, then we needed really fast moving indicators. And bacteria, like after months and years of piloting, we found that measure to be the fastest moving compared to like adulteration, which like mixing with water. Maybe people do that, or maybe people don't. I mean, it was much more noisy to kind of separate out like actual content of water in milk at the time of milking, because that also varies around the gestation cycle of cattle. And other kind of measures required costly investment, like some cattle breeds are known to produce a certain quality of milk. So unless you change your cattle breed, which is a really, really expensive intervention, and nobody is going to do that kind of put that kind of effort for our intervention. So this was for to measure outcomes within a year of our intervention. This was the fastest moving metric and valuable from a policy sense.
Before we go to the next question, I just had a quick thought on that. Like, you might be able to, given you have a really large treatment effect, and if you know the threshold which the aggregating facility uses to pass the milk from pasteurized to whatever the next level is, you could probably sort of assess whether the treatment effect is large enough to move some of the milk away from pasteurized to the next level up, which is higher higher quality, and maybe better for the facility. To sort of target that question directly, to say, look, it's not all going to go to pasteurization anyway. If you just know what those thresholds are, I think you could probably apply your results to those in some way. Next is Braha.
Hi, it's a very good presentation. Just, I think already Manaswini already mentioned. I just want to know if you have, because in India, you usually give price based upon the fat content. Already you have mentioned, but if you would see the clean versus fat content, I think most of the farmers, the field level, if you the ground level, they are paid based upon the fat. And they also, I have seen, they also try to keep milk clean if you have better price, and they are paid with that also by the cooperatives with the fat content, the cooperatives. But what happened at the cooperative level, they try to mix the all milk, like as you mentioned, to maximize their profit at the cooperative level. And it depends upon what kind of cooperative is. If the cooperative is a very urban area, close to city center, or like it's not far distance, you will have a better mechanism, or you will have a better clean all things. If you go to a little bit distance, then that is also impact on the quality and the payment to farmers, and so many things are involved. How you are looking on that? Like, that's my simple,
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So the way farmers are paid are based on fat and SNF, as I call it, solid non-fat. And these are the two parameters. And the farmers basically get paid based on, I mean, in practice, right, like each week after week, I mean, the farmers are paid every 2 weeks. And at the time of collection center, they just record what is known as the degree of milk, because not all cooperative societies have fat and SNF measuring equipment. Some have, but they do the specific gravity test and what they call degree. Now, degree is kind of correlated with the fat and SNF. And so they record the degree, they record the quantity of milk. Like if this farmer came, produced 5 liters, this 2.5 liters, and so on. And at the end of 2 weeks, they just pay like, okay, for like a degree of 30, the price is basically 2 rupees or so on, so on. So 2 multiplied by 5 liters, okay, 10 liters, right? So that's, sorry, 10 rupees, whatever. Sorry, I mean, I just gave 2, but it's like around 20 or 30 per liter. And so they get like 100 rupees or so on, depending on the liters produced per day, right? And so that gets aggregated for 2 weeks and then given to the farmer in cash or bank account. Back then it was still cash when we did this. Now, regarding peri-urban areas, we did this study in a rural district in Karnataka. It was like Dharwad district. So it's away from Bangalore or Mysore, which are the large urban centers in Karnataka. And so most of our villages were very, very rural. Like I said, even to reach the district headquarters, it took about 2 hours. And so we had to invest in like icebox and like, getting our teams to go and come in cars, for example, all of that. So we've spent a lot of money and budget on arranging these logistics. So they were not really from peri-urban areas, and most of the dairy cooperative societies were like uniformly rural.
Okay, Nils, go ahead.
Thanks. If I may, another question. So, in your headline results, you showed that the public information had half the effect of the private information. But later you showed us your differentiated graphs that actually private and public were very similar if the opt-outs were taken out.
Yeah.
I think that's a real important aspect to the results, isn't it? That these opt-outs, they completely messed up your public arm. Is it possible to include that with your sort of core analysis? That either you drop them if you then still have power, or you show them as a separate group. Because if you just present them as part of the public, but you have these 2 very different behaviors over the course of your study, you really sort of confound the results quite seriously, don't you? I can't really see how you can do it accurately. And overall, of course, your results are right, but this huge difference between those cooperatives where they were opted out and those where they kept on, and it is really quite striking. And
no, I completely agree. And so what we present basically are all ITT, like intent to treat. So basically, these public and so the groups that were assigned to public and private were all randomized. And so the intent to treat estimates are half. And of course, this mask. So we do an IV, like we do treatment on the treated. But again, given that we have only 51 clusters, the IV is also not precisely estimated. So I don't know if we report that in the paper, but we did an IV, and where we found the point estimate slightly improve, but we don't get super large precision improvement. But I agree that which is why we have those graphs in our figures, that if you just you kind of account for those opt-outs, which look very different. Like we can't just drop because they're endogenous. Then they line up.
Yeah, I think I would just say that if you take them out, then that's obviously endogenous. But it does appear that those that opted out are driving this difference between public and private. And so then it does beg the question of, okay, what is the motivation for opting out of this incentive? Which I don't think you're going to be able to have a smoking gun at the paper by any means, but you're going to want to just clearly say that here's some possibilities about why that is, and you're probably going to have to leave it at
open questions.
These are because one of the things I said in my slides that I didn't talk about is I sort of applaud you for not pushing the data too far with 51 villages and doing a bunch of speculative heterogeneity that's driven by one village or 2 villages. I think that's we often see that in these RCTs, and it's often not that compelling. We only have 4 minutes. Are there any other last questions? Other questions?
If there's no other hands, then I'll go ahead and ask one. Kyle, Manaswini, thanks. Just in terms of the testing that you did, the sort of the details there on the MBRT, how does, just give us a sense of the costs of that relative to the the cost of the test relative to the kind of cost that the research team bore by kind of providing that cold chain of the samples going to the lab and back and forth. Like, how does that all sort of break out? What's the expensive part? Is it the logistics of getting the test to the lab and back, or is the test itself, somewhat non-trivially expensive?
Yeah, so I think that's some of it is straightforward. Like, I mean, it's just the cost of, because we had a vendor to do the testing. So MBRT was orders of magnitude lower than the standard plate count, which I think the standard plate count for one test was in thousands of rupees, like it's in 2,000 per test or something, because it involved like a lab equipment and a technician to kind of sit and count. Mm-hmm. And so, which is why we couldn't scale it. MBRT, on the other hand, was a few tens of rupees. Like I guess it was 50 or 100 per sample. Like I mean, it was like at least 10x smaller than the standard plate count. Now, comparing it with the logistics, now, like we had to pay, of course, for the enumerated team to go and come, right? So I have not. So the only other additional logistics that we did was providing the ice box, which is like a one-time investment, right? Sure. And also like arranging cabs instead of sending them on bikes, maybe. So it's like, so I don't know like how to kind of disentangle. Oh, we had to pay the enumerators for traveling anyway, and now like there's this additional icebox cost plus like taxi travel. But let's say like if there was no research, so if you want to do it from a policy perspective, like where you don't have any like research enumerators going, but you have to put in the logistics, that could be expensive unless you can like sort of overlay on the collection center, supply chain, right? So like those guys who are going to bring those cans or bottles in the autos or whatever, like those trucks that you saw, along with, you could just pay that person extra to kind of pick up some samples. So that could be one way of scaling up. But MBRT on its own is not a very expensive tool. It's just, you have to buy the reagent, and potentially if you train the secretaries well enough, they could do it, maybe, but yeah.
Thanks.
Well, thanks. Perfect timing. 10:30 Eastern, at least now it's your coffee time, Manaswini, 7:30.
I had some coffee already, but not too much, because I didn't want to be like strung up.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for the presentation. That was really, really fun. We really appreciate it. So we are back in action with the SPIA webinar about a month from now, probably. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.